He knocked on the door, eviction notice in hand, ready to end another overdue lease, just business, nothing personal. But when the door creaked open, it wasn't a tenant standing there. It was two little girls in oversized sweaters, alone, scared, and holding a letter with his name on it, written by someone he hadn't seen in over a decade. What happened next would change his life in ways he never saw coming. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's jump into the story. Gerald Whitmore did not believe in surprises. At 62, his life was neat, predictable, and planned down to the minute. Every morning, he ate a boiled egg with toast. Every afternoon, he checked his stocks. And once a month, like clockwork, he reviewed the list of late rent payments. He had built his wealth on discipline and decisions. Gerald didn't give second chances. Second chances cost money. So when his longtime property manager, Mrs. Talbot, handed him a manila folder labeled Unit 2A, 3 months overdue, he barely blinked. He signed the notice, folded it neatly into his coat pocket, and drove his black sedan across the city to a small neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. Maple Street used to be a quiet, tidy row of townhouses. Now, weeds pushed through sidewalk, cracks and old paint peeled from every porch. Gerald pulled up to number 217 and frowned. The lawn was overgrown. One shutter dangled on its last hinge. He walked up the path, his polished shoes crunching dry leaves. The plan was simple. Knock, deliver, leave. No small talk. No negotiation. He knocked twice. The door creaked open slowly, not by an adult, but by a child. A small girl, no older than 6, peered up at him. She wore a red sweater 2 sizes too big and held a plastic doll with a missing arm. Her eyes were wide, cautious. "Is your mother home?" Gerald asked, softening his voice without realizing. The girl shook her head slowly. "She said she'd be back last week," said a second voice behind her. Another girl, slightly older, stepped into view. She wore mismatched socks and stood, with a kind of forced bravery that didn't match her age. Gerald hesitated. "Back last week?" "She had to go fix something," said the younger one, stepping forward. Her voice wobbled. "But she said if something happened, you would help." Gerald blinked. "Me?" The older girl nodded, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him without a word. His name was written on the envelope, Gerald Whitmore, in handwriting he hadn't seen in over a decade. He unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "Gerald, if you're reading this, I've failed to come back. I didn't know who else to trust. These are my girls, Nina and Rosie. They have no one else. Please take care of them." Maribel, his heart stopped. Maribel. The name hit him like a wave. He hadn't thought about her in years. They had known each other briefly, long ago. She had rented one of his first apartments, a single mom with eyes that always saw more than he liked. They'd shared late-night conversations and cups of weak coffee. But when Gerald landed a big real estate deal out of town, he left without saying goodbye. He stared down at the 2 girls. "You're Maribel's children?" They nodded. "Where have you been sleeping?" he asked. "In our beds," Rosie said simply. "But the light stopped working, and the cereal is gone." Gerald looked past them into the dim hallway. It smelled like dust and something faintly sweet, maybe lavender. He stepped inside. The living room was nearly bare. A small couch, a folded blanket, a pile of picture books. The kitchen had no electricity. In the fridge, only a nearly empty bottle of milk and a sticky note with heating instructions for canned food. Gerald reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the eviction notice. He stared at it, then slowly folded it in half. Then again, until the paper was so small it disappeared into his palm. Without a word, he tore it into pieces. "I'll be right back," he said. He drove to the corner diner and returned, with grilled cheese sandwiches and soup. The girls sat at the tiny table, eating like they hadn't had a warm meal in days. He watched them silently. They whispered to each other before answering his questions. They never let each other out of sight, and their eyes kept drifting toward the front door, as if still hoping their mother would walk through it. That night, Gerald sat alone in his car for a long time. He stared at the house. The porch light was still broken. The window curtain moved, slightly, maybe Rosie, maybe Nina peeking out. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Benji? It's Gerald. I need a favor. Quiet, fast, and thorough. I need you to find someone named Maribel Rios. She's missing. I need to know where she is. Anything you can find." He ended the call and let the phone fall into the seat beside him. For the first time in years, Gerald Whitmore didn't feel like a man with a plan. The next morning, Gerald woke with a start. He had fallen asleep on his office couch, fully dressed, his coat still on. A half-finished cup of coffee sat cold on the table beside him. His head ached, not from the couch, but from the weight of everything that had changed in a single day. The girls. The letter. Maribel. He checked his phone. A text from Benji, the private investigator, blinked on the screen. Still digging. County records turned up nothing. Calling hospitals next. Gerald closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he reached for his keys and headed out the door. Back at the small townhouse on Maple Street, the girls were awake. Rosie was sitting on the living room floor, coloring with a broken red crayon. Nina was sitting by the window, staring out at the street. When Gerald walked in with a grocery bag, both girls looked up, startled until they recognized him. "I brought breakfast," he said awkwardly, holding up a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. Their faces lit up like he'd brought treasure. As they ate, Gerald wandered the small apartment again. There were no adults here, just the traces of one. Notes in curly handwriting on the fridge, an empty tea tin on the counter, a family photo on the wall, taped slightly crooked. Maribel stood in the center, smiling wide, with her arms around the two girls. There was no one else in the picture. He sat on the floor beside them and asked gently, "Do you remember where your mom was going when she left?" Rosie nodded. "She said she had to take the bus somewhere to fix something important." "Did she say when she'd be back?" Nina looked down. "Last week," she whispered. Gerald felt a hollow space open in his chest, a quiet kind of fear. Not panic, but something worse, a slow, creeping dread. He called Benji again later that afternoon. "Any news?" he asked. Benji sighed on the other end. "She's not in the system. No recent ID scans, no rental applications. But I found something odd. A traffic camera caught her car 2 weeks ago, then nothing. Like she vanished." Gerald gripped the phone tighter. "Keep going. I will." "And Gerald? You sure you're okay?" He looked over at the girls curled up on the couch, fast asleep, the smaller one using a stuffed animal as a pillow. "No," he said softly, "but I will be." That night, Gerald drove home to his penthouse. The view of the city from his windows was as stunning as ever, but it felt cold. He wandered into the guest room he hadn't opened in years. It still smelled like unused furniture and dust. He opened an old storage box under the bed and pulled out a photo album. Inside were memories he had almost forgotten, the early days of his business, snapshots of buildings he'd renovated, and, near the back, a picture he didn't expect to see. It was Maribel, standing beside him outside a tiny coffee shop. Her eyes were laughing, her hair tied back in a loose braid. His arm was around her shoulder. Her hand rested on his chest. They had been happy once. Not for long, but long enough that he remembered how it felt. They met when she was renting a small studio in one of his first buildings. She was an art teacher back then, full of energy and strange ideas. She talked about colors like they were people, and believed every problem had a soft answer. Gerald hadn't believed in softness. He was building an empire. There had been no space for feelings, so he left, and she didn't chase him. Now, years later, her daughters were sleeping in a cold apartment, trusting a man they barely knew. And Gerald wasn't sure what scared him more, that he might not find Maribel, or that he might find out too late. The next morning, he returned to Maple Street with clean clothes, fresh food, and a set of keys. "You're not staying here tonight," he said gently. The girls looked confused. "I've got a place for you," he added. "Safe, warm." They didn't argue. They simply nodded and followed him out the door. He brought them to his penthouse. It was too big, too quiet, and far too clean. But he showed them the guest wing, let them pick their beds, and found himself standing in the hallway later that evening, watching Rosie draw on his imported wallpaper with a marker. He didn't even stop her. Instead, he made grilled cheese. Again, this time slightly less burnt, and listened as Nina told him about her favorite storybook character, a frog who always saved the day, even though he was scared. That night, Gerald sat by the window with a blanket over his knees. His phone rang. It was Benji. "I found her," he said quietly. Gerald held his breath. "She's in a coma, Gerald. Car accident. No ID. She's been at County General for over 2 weeks. As a Jane Doe." The line went quiet. Gerald stood slowly, heart thudding in his chest. The lights of the city stretched out in front of him, bright and endless. But all he could think about was a woman lying in a hospital bed, and 2 little girls who didn't know their world was about to shift again. Room 418 was quiet, too quiet. Gerald Whitmore stood just outside the hospital room, staring through the small window. Inside, Maribel lay still, surrounded by machines that beeped softly and a monitor that blinked with each slow beat of her heart. She looked smaller than he remembered. Her face was pale, a bandage wrapped around her head. Tubes ran from her arms. Her hair, once long and full of movement, was now tied in a thin braid resting on the pillow. The nurse beside him, Camille, spoke gently. "She's stable, but she hasn't woken up yet." Gerald nodded, still staring. "Can I go in?" Camille opened the door without answering and gave him a small smile. "She might hear you. People in comas sometimes do." He stepped inside. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air. The machines hummed. The chair beside the bed was uncomfortable, but he sat anyway. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. "Maribel," he said, his voice low and rough. "It's me." Gerald. No response. No twitch. No blink. He tried again, quieter this time. "You told them I'd help. You remembered that promise. I don't know why, but I'm here." He sat with her for over an hour, just watching her breathe. He didn't say much more. He didn't know what to say. But before he left, he did something he hadn't done in years. He cried. Back at his penthouse, things were changing quickly. Nina and Rosie had turned the guest wing into a small world of color and chaos. Crayons covered the floor. A fort made of blankets now lived in the hallway. Gerald's once quiet mornings were filled with spilled cereal, tiny footsteps, and the sound of cartoons echoing through the halls. At first, he wasn't sure what to do. He had never been around children before, but slowly he learned. He burned pancakes. They laughed. He read bedtime stories. Badly. They listened anyway. The girls didn't ask many questions. They didn't ask where their mother was. They didn't ask how long they were staying. They simply followed him with quiet trust. That made it harder, because Gerald didn't have answers. He didn't even know if he was the person they needed. The results would come soon. The ones that could change everything. He'd sent in a DNA test the day after visiting Maribel. The girls looked like her, yes. But part of him wondered. Could they be his? It was possible. He and Maribel had shared a life, even if it was brief. Maybe she'd never had the chance to tell him. And if they were his, what then? 3 days later, the envelope arrived. It sat on his kitchen counter for nearly an hour before he touched it. He stared at it like it might bite. Finally, he opened it with shaking hands. Biological father. Not a match. Gerald didn't move. For a long time, he just sat there, the paper still in his lap, the words blurring. They weren't his. Not by blood, not by name, not by any legal standard. He had no reason to stay involved, no obligation, no ties, and yet his chest ached. Rosie's tiny hand had gripped his tightly when they crossed the street the day before. Nina had drawn a picture of the three of them at breakfast. She'd given him a crayon smile and a crown. He could walk away now. But something inside him whispered, "Don't." That night, after dinner, he called them into his study. It was the only room in the house still untouched by their presence. No toys. No laughter, just quiet. The girls sat on the couch looking unsure. He knelt down in front of them, trying to find the right words. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Nina's hand reached for Rosie's. "I'm not your real dad," Gerald said softly. "And I don't know what's going to happen with your mom. But I want you to know something important." He paused. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to be afraid. You're safe now." Rosie looked up at him with wet eyes. Nina wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "I knew you were good." For the first time in his life, Gerald felt something bigger than success. He felt needed. Later that week, he returned to room 418. This time, he brought drawings, a stuffed frog, a photo of the girls on his penthouse balcony. He sat by her side and showed them all to her one by one. "These are your girls," he said. "They're safe, they're smiling." Still, she didn't wake, but he kept talking. "I wasn't there before, Maribel, when it mattered. I left. And I've thought about that for a long time. Maybe too long. But I'm here now. I'm here because of you. Because you believed I'd keep a promise I forgot I made." Her hand didn't move. Her eyes didn't flutter. But Gerald didn't leave. Not this time. 6 weeks passed. Room 418 didn't feel so cold anymore. There were flowers on the windowsill, a soft blue blanket at the end of the bed, and on the wall, taped neatly beside the heart monitor, 2 crayon drawings of smiling girls with curly hair, holding hands with a tall man in a green sweater. One morning, as the sun lit the corner of the hospital room, Maribel opened her eyes. She blinked slowly as if waking from a deep, heavy dream. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor and the soft breathing of the man sitting in the chair beside her. Gerald. He was half asleep, chin tucked into his chest, holding a storybook he had clearly been reading out loud. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Gerald?" His eyes shot open. For a moment he just stared. Then he stood up so quickly the chair almost tipped over. "You're awake," he breathed. "You're really awake." She tried to smile, but her face ached. "How long?" "Since the accident." "About 6 weeks." She closed her eyes again, tears forming. "The girls, Nina and Rosie, are they okay?" "They're with me," he said gently. "They've been with me since the day I found your letter." More tears slipped down her cheeks. Gerald reached for a tissue, not sure if it was for her or for himself. "I never thought I'd see you again," she whispered. "I didn't expect to come back," he admitted. "But here we are." A silence hung between them for a few seconds. Then, she said something that caught him off guard. "They're not mine." Gerald frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're my nieces," she said, voice shaking. "My sister died giving birth. I wasn't supposed to raise them, but I couldn't leave them behind. They had no one else." He sat back slowly, stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid you'd think I was asking for help out of guilt. I remembered what you said all those years ago. You told me, if you ever really need something, call me. So I wrote your name on that envelope and told the girls you'd help. I didn't know if you'd come." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her. This woman who had once been a fleeting part of his past and had now somehow become the reason his life felt full again. "You kept a promise I forgot I made," he said quietly. 3 months later, the adoption papers were signed. Nina and Rosie sat on the bench beside Gerald in the courthouse dressed in matching yellow dresses. Rosie had a bow in her hair, and Nina held a small stuffed frog in her lap. Judge Melton smiled warmly as she handed over the final documents. "Congratulations, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "You are now their legal guardian." The girls didn't really understand the paperwork, but they understood one thing. They were staying. Forever. Outside the courthouse, Maribel waited in a wheelchair, still recovering but stronger every day. Gerald helped her into the car and Nina handed her a lollipop she'd saved from a jar at the front desk. "For you," she said, "because it's a special day." That night, the penthouse was louder than usual. There was pizza on the counter, a pile of coloring books on the floor. Gerald walked through the hallway in socks and a soft t-shirt, a far cry from the sharp suits he used to wear every day. Maribel moved in too, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as family. The home that once echoed with silence now sang with music and laughter. In the mornings, Gerald learned to braid hair and burn toast less often. He drove the girls to school in a car that now had stickers on the windows and crayons in the cup holders. At night, he read storybooks, better now, and listened as the girls shared their day, their dreams, and their worries. One evening, Rosie asked, "Are we still going to live here when we grow up?" Gerald smiled. "You can live wherever you want, but this will always be your home." Maribel sat beside him on the couch sipping tea, her feet tucked beneath her. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You've changed," she said with a smile. He looked at her, then at the messy living room filled with toys, drawings, and giggles in the next room. "No," he said softly. "I just finally figured out what mattered." Months passed. The townhouse on Maple Street was renovated and reopened, not as rental housing but as a safe shelter for single mothers and their children. Maribel helped run it. Gerald helped fund it. And every weekend, the four of them visited. Together, the girls would run through the garden behind the house, laughing. Maribel would sit on the porch with a notebook, writing. Gerald, usually watching quietly, sometimes joined in the play, throwing a ball, helping plant flowers, or simply being there. He used to build homes. Now he had one, and it wasn't made of bricks or stone. It was made of trust, of small hands in his, of promises kept, of family found not by blood, but by choice. The man who once came to evict strangers had been given the greatest gift of all. A home.